Something else about the curling point that I wanted to make was that a lot of brands also try to cozy up to those sports in those moments without paying for Olympic sponsorship via
Right.
social media. So I know you're talking about curling, so I can make this meme about curling that somehow relates to my soap brand or my water bottle brand or whatever,
Right.
and kind of hijack that moment to draw some attention to my brand.
But it's what's interesting is though that with and you use the example of Nike earlier, like Nike obviously is a shoe brand or it's an athletic brand, but you see, especially in the Summer Olympics, athletes wearing, Nike spikes if they're running on the track. They're not paying for, the USA sponsorship, but they have the benefit of having that athlete kind of on retainer as one of their own. Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today. The world of advertising is a very busy space during the month of February. Usually it's because of the Super Bowl, but it is multiplied this year because not only do you have the big game, as you have to use it in most cases, but you also have the Winter Olympics this go round, which is, of course, a 2-week long opportunity, not only for athletes, but also for companies to try and gain the attention of the consumer. But how do companies prepare for such an event? Pleasure to be joined by Annie Wilson, who's a senior lecturer in marketing here at the Wharton School. Annie, great to talk to you today. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
So let me start there because it is interesting that how do you think about the difference between how companies will prepare for a Super Bowl in comparison to preparing for something like the Olympics?
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison. I think it also there's a difference between summer and winter Olympic games, but obviously the winter Olympic games are going to be the ones that overlap with the Super Bowl in terms of timing. I think with the Super Bowl, there's a heavier emphasis on trying to capture that spike of attention and excitement. And so you see like a greater use of humor, for example, and also trying to create hype around the ad that's going to come out and then get people to talk about it afterward. With the Olympics, it's obviously a longer moment in time. It's several weeks, and there's a long tail of lead up that allows for, I think, more involved storytelling. And so you see more kind of long running campaigns around the Olympics in terms of trying to appear endemic in the sports world or show up as a global brand. And around the Super Bowl, it's really trying to capture that really small moment of lightning in a bottle where everybody's eyes are on the ads in this game.
Both events have corporate partners, but it feels like when you watch the Olympics, there is more emphasis on mentioning that X company is a global partner or corporate partner of the U.S. Olympic Federation.
Yes, that's definitely true. And the Olympics is very protective of the Olympics IP and the rings and who can claim to be a sponsor and use what intellectual property and imagery. What I think is interesting is when brands actually engage in ambush marketing around the Olympics. So they show up really heavily, but they're not actually official sponsors. Nike did this pretty famously in the 90s in Atlanta. Beats by Dre did it pretty famously in London in 2012. And so yes, you see this use of these global partners, and what they're trying to do is show we're a global brand. So we're for
Right.
everybody. That gives you some prestige, and some, a bit of an edge from a brand equity perspective on the global stage. But it is really a small handful of brands that get to officially claim their partnership with the Olympics.
So when you're watching the Super Bowl, one of the things that we've seen over the years is the want, in many cases, to tell a story. And in some cases, you'll see a company might have 2 spots or 3 commercials in the Super Bowl so that they can tell that story over a period of time. I don't think we see that as much during the Olympics, right? It's really about delivering that message, whether it be the connection to U.S. Olympic team or the connection to the United States or kind of that feel good message that the company wants to deliver.
Yeah, I would say that feels generally true. There's also a lot of on the Olympic stage getting your brand to show up from an awareness perspective. So I just want my logo to show up somewhere. I want to be associated with the games. I do think though what I've observed, at least anecdotally, is in the Olympics there's a lot more of piggybacking off of the existing stories of the Olympians or the teams. Versus in the Super Bowl, there's more telling brand originating stories because I can make up, a number of theories as to why you might not do that so much in the Super Bowl, but
Yeah.
the storytelling is more contained to the brand rather than the existing narratives around the athletes like Phelps or the gymnastics team or whomever they're talking about.
So you mentioned earlier summer versus winter Olympics. Are there dynamics that are different in how companies think about the marketing or the advertising that they might do in each one of those different events?
Yeah, so generally the Summer Olympics tends to have a broader audience base. Obviously, it takes place in a warmer climate. It's warmer games, and so how brands show up is a little bit different from in terms of the mood from that perspective. From for the Winter Olympics, it tends to be a smaller audience, but a more premium audience, particularly in the U.S. and Europe. It's usually a more affluent audience, so you get some more prestige brands for that reason, and there's a little bit of a greater focus on performance technology from brands in the
Right.
Winter Games, given the different sports that they're engaging in. Um, yeah, so those would be the big differences. But still, both games have like their marquee moments that the brands want to get in on.
And so does the event that maybe the company wants to advertise around, whether it be downhill skiing or hockey, does that matter and it come into their thinking? And I say that because in the last couple of Olympics, curling has become this unbelievably loved sport here in the United States. And it feels like more people talk about curling, at least in this 2 week window, than we've ever seen.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about how you just put that though is how much they talk about in this 2 week window, because yeah, it's also how much do you talk about it outside of this 2 week window is worth noting. Certainly brands try to cozy up to particular sports. And that can help if you have an audience of people who care about that sport and want to talk about it. Now, if you made yourself, the official whatever of curling, how much does that get people to
Right.
want to be associated with it? It's not, at least in the US, it's not totally clear how valuable that would be other than just showing up and being kind of visible in the space as people are watching it.
There's also the attachment to the USA brand, and obviously, when you're watching the Olympics, there's such a kind of a national connection that many people have when they're watching a US athlete compete in some sort of event. How important is that for the company when they're thinking about making that investment to realize that part of this is showing that their brand is connected more so to the country than maybe some of their rivals?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and you see that particularly in the uniforms, like with Ralph Lauren, for example, or Lululemon in the Canadian uniforms, of wanting to be associated with the national brand and the supporting the athletes of the nation. I think what's really fascinating is how much more patriotic the Super Bowl seems to have become in recent years. I think like Budweiser's ad, for example, in the most recent Super Bowl of the Clydesdale that then has the bald eagle on
Yeah.
its back and like raising it. Like it was very notably patriotic, I thought, more than past Super Bowls, which, there's obviously a lot of political discourse around the advertisers and the halftime show and decisions around the games this year. So it's interesting to me that that has actually become, to me, a little bigger emphasis on the nation versus being a global brand. Something else about the curling point that I wanted to make was that a lot of brands also try to cozy up to those sports in those moments without paying for Olympic sponsorship via
Right.
social media. So I know you're talking about curling, so I can make this meme about curling that somehow relates to my soap brand or my water bottle brand or whatever,
Right.
and kind of hijack that moment to draw some attention to my brand.
But it's what's interesting is though that with and you use the example of Nike earlier, like Nike obviously is a shoe brand or it's an athletic brand, but you see, especially in the Summer Olympics, athletes wearing, Nike spikes if they're running on the track. They're not paying for, the USA sponsorship, but they have the benefit of having that athlete kind of on retainer as one of their own. And so they're getting the advertising without really even having to foot that extra bill as well.
Oh, absolutely. And brands that are smart about it, I'm thinking about like Brooks Running from the most recent summer games, capitalizing on their world champion runners of using that imagery that they capture in the Olympics and then putting it in their ads later too. So they can actually bring that sponsorship forward and kind of milk it for a longer period of time. Sponsoring the individual athletes is certainly like a way to get in on the games. I think what's interesting now too is how brands are showing up more during the games in a way that used to be very unsavory. So Samsung in the last summer games, the athletes were taking selfies on the medal stand with their Samsung phones.
Right.
Like that was a sacred place for many years being on the medal stand. And now you have, Simone Biles with a Samsung phone taking a selfie. I think brands are showing up more with the athletes actually holding and using their goods.
How much of a challenge is it for a brand, and I'll say maybe for a newer brand like OnCloud, to try and get as much publicity as they can around an event like Olympics, especially when they are going up against the likes of Nike, Adidas, Brooks, New Balance, so many other of the more established brands that have been around for such a long period of time.
Yeah, I think that's again being smart on your sponsorships. Like, I mean, especially with OnCloud, for example, just having Federer has been huge for them that they can have the cloud of one or a handful of athletes that can really drive that brand awareness and that brand love forward. Um, I think again that's a great time to use really scrappy ambush marketing. Like maybe you can't afford to be on the medal stand or
Right.
to have that prime time slot. So where else can you show up? And I think that's where you see a lot of advertisers just getting creative with guerrilla marketing and using out of home marketing geographically near where games are happening, showing up on the athletes in some way in a way that appears very natural. I think brands are getting really creative with that because they have to, because they don't have the budget to outspend the Nikes and the Visas of the world.
But usually when you're talking about, doing a Super Bowl ad or an ad in another big event like the Olympics, most cases, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is part of some sort of campaign where some of this will end up being kind of on the ground, boots on the ground, where you'll have your brand being marketed at different venues. Does that occur as much at the Olympics as, say, it may at a Super Bowl or at a World Series or the NCAA tournament, for example?
Yeah, I would argue in some ways it may occur more at the Olympics from the perspective of these kind of creating the foundations for these long running campaigns. And I'm thinking about how using the Olympics can get you associated with certain adjectives around performance and national pride and resilience and, any of the underdogs. And so I'm even thinking about like Procter and Gamble's Thank You Moms that has
Oh, yeah.
run for quite a while around the games of using that as an opportunity for storytelling that lives beyond the games. The Super Bowl, I mean, also often can be the beginning or the climax of campaigns. CeraVe last year at the Super Bowl was a great example of using the game as the climax of their Michael Cera campaign or the beginning of a new campaign. But in a lot of ways, it serves as this like spike moment. And so you do
Right.
also see in the Super Bowl, you create ads that can stand alone for the brand, that contain the whole story or the whole moment so that we've all seen it and remember it, and I don't need to know everything else before and after it to appreciate it.
So we also have a Summer Olympics here in the United States in Los Angeles in 2028. I assume that companies are already thinking about their plans and their ideas of what they're going to do during the Olympics in 28, or if they want to be a part of that right now.
I would hope so, because you do need to plan pretty far in advance. I'm not sure when the games or the broadcasters actually open the window to sell the various spaces in real estate. Typically, you have a pretty long runway of what you're planning for in terms of what you're going to run and the assets you're going to use. And then also, typically, the media companies hold back a little bit of real estate so they can sell some stuff at a premium in a scramble for those who didn't get in and maybe want to get in last minute, and that drives more money for the media companies.
Maximizing profits. Yep. I've seen it a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah.
Yes, exactly. Annie, pleasure to talk to you. Enjoy the games. Thanks very much for your time today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Annie Wilson, who is a senior lecturer in marketing here at the Wharton School. Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review so that we can continue to bring you the best insight from the Wharton School.